Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us at our first Fairhaven lecture of the fall 2020 season. We are happy to have you here online with us. I'm Carrie Bourne. I'm from the Office of Continuing Education at UW-Whitewater, and our office has hosted the Fairhaven Lecture Series since 1983. Typically, we are at Fairhaven Senior Services in Whitewater, but this year we're doing things a little differently for the health and safety of the Fairhaven residents, of our presenters, and for the entire community. We're going online this year. So thank you for joining us. If you're at home, and we're recording this lecture right now, so thank you for joining us later if you decide to take a look at our website. Please do note that the lecture is being recorded, and if you are here live, feel free to use the chat feature to ask any questions of our presenter. We'll address those questions at the end of her presentation, but you can put them in the chat feature at any time. So let me go ahead and introduce today's speaker. Dr. Susan Johnson is Assistant Dean for Student Success in the UW-Whitewater College of Letters and Sciences, coordinator of the Legal Eagles Freshman Learning Community, and teaches Writing and Political Science course each semester. Dr. Johnson served as chair of the Political Science Department for 8 years prior to being appointed Assistant Dean. She earned a PhD at Northern Illinois University and has been at UW-Whitewater since 1997 and is a frequent contributor to our series, and we really appreciate having her kick off the fall 2020 series today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Susan Johnson.
Thank you, Carrie. And as you mentioned, the series has been around since 1983. I think my first time would have been the 2000 election. So we participated, and that was an exciting series as well. And I'm glad to be back for the 2020 election season. So my job today is to provide everyone with a recap of the 2020 presidential nomination process to get you all set and ready for what's to come in the next 6 weeks. So we can consider this, I paid careful attention so you didn't have to. And we'll get you all set to go for the election that's coming up very quickly in November. So the way I'm going to frame this lecture today is with the idea of the 4 seasons of the nomination process and break it down into winter, spring, summer, and fall. And one of the consistent themes that I see coming through with this nomination process is that it seems like there was always something overshadowing the actual nomination process itself. And in the winter, we can think back and remember there was an impeachment going on. So that seems like ages ago, but that was just late 2019 and early 2020. And then in spring, we had the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic and everything that went along with that. And then this summer, we had the racial justice protests that went on across the country. And then for the fall, we had the sad passing of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and her impact on the election moving forward is already being felt. So as I go through and speak about the nomination process, what I want to do is highlight some of the things that took place last winter and spring and summer, and then give us all some things to look forward to in the next 6 weeks before the November election. So as we think about the winter, and we think about getting us to the winter, the number of Democrats running for the Democratic presidential nomination was 29. And as you'll see, the first part of my talk is going to focus pretty significantly on the Democrats because the Democrats were the ones who were having an actual nomination battle. There were a couple of challengers to President Trump. Bill Weld, who had been the governor of Massachusetts, and then Joe Walsh, who had been a member of Congress from Illinois. In fact, he was my member of Congress for the 2 terms he served. And they both ran, but they both dropped out. So we're not going to spend any time talking about the Republican nomination process, but we will start talking about the Republicans once we move more into thinking about the summer and obviously for the fall. So the Democrats started with 29 candidates, and the debates actually began in June of 2019. So we began that process quite early. And by the time we get to the December and then into January of the Democratic nomination process, we had already seen the winnowing of the field a bit. And by the time we actually begin voting, we're down to 11 candidates. But in the meantime, there were quite a few debates, 11 in fact, and as I said, beginning in June of 2019. And there was a lot going on as far as who was participating in the debates. You might recall that for much of the time in the fall, there were 2 debates. So people were being randomly assigned to those debates. And also we had situations where who was eligible and who wasn't became quite controversial. And what we saw then as far as the winnowing is that by the time we get to, as I said, 2020, we've lost some of the candidates, and by the time we get to February 1st, we're down to about 11. And one of the things that's important to highlight, in this we see throughout the nomination process and still coming up, as we speak, is this idea of 2 different branches within the Democratic Party that are really vying for attention. And so throughout the nomination process and the debates and advertisements and endorsements and all of that, you had the more progressive or liberal wing that would be identified most notably with Bernie Sanders. And then you had the more moderate wing, most notably identified with Vice President Biden. And the divisions within those 2 groups of Democrats came to the fore over and over again throughout the early nomination process. And I think the 2 biggest issues I would identify where we saw that would have been on healthcare and on the environment. And so you may recall that a big issue for the Democrats was whether or not you supported Medicare for all or not. And so that was a big point that was discussed among Democrats at the debates and throughout the nomination process. And then also the idea of how far left to go on the environment and who was embracing the idea of the Green New Deal and who wasn't. And so we had this divide going on within the candidates and also within the party. And that really provides context for the nomination process as we actually get to the voting in February. And then as we move forward into ultimately Vice President Biden gaining the nomination and making concessions to the more liberal or progressive wing of the Democratic Party. So we get to February, and there are 4 contests that are scheduled for February, and it's been this way through the most recent few nomination processes. And as we all recall, Iowa and New Hampshire come first. And the Democratic National Committee added Nevada and South Carolina a few cycles ago to make the process more diverse, both geographically and racially. And so Iowa, as the first in the nation caucus, was held on February 3rd. And if you were watching, you might recall how contentious and controversial it got. The organization system wasn't so great, and the results were not known that evening. And what we learned over the few days that followed was that it was kind of a split result. So you had Pete Buttigieg, the former mayor of South Bend, who received the most delegates, but you had Bernie Sanders, who received the most votes. And there was a bit of back and forth that went on throughout the week between Iowa and New Hampshire, and that didn't allow either candidate to claim a clear victory. And so some people argue that that was an issue that didn't give anybody that big boost that they like to see coming out of Iowa. And then again, as we do every time, we move on to New Hampshire. And what's most interesting about New Hampshire isn't necessarily so much who won, but who did quite poorly, unexpectedly quite poorly. And so New Hampshire comes just a week after the Iowa caucuses, and what we see happening there is that Bernie Sanders wins and Pete Buttigieg comes in second. But interestingly, Elizabeth Warren, who is the senator from Massachusetts, quite close to New Hampshire, did quite poorly. She finished in sixth place, I believe. And that was quite a surprise, and people thought that might have dealt a death blow to her campaign. And Joe Biden came in fifth, and again, people thought that was the end of Biden. In fact, he didn't even stick around in New Hampshire for the caucus results. He took off the day of in the morning and was campaigning in South Carolina by that evening. And that really showed how little faith he was holding in doing well in New Hampshire. And then there was the Nevada caucuses that took place a week later, and Bernie Sanders won that, and Biden came in second. And then we have what many people point to as the pivotal moment in the Democratic nomination process, and that would have been the South Carolina primary. The photograph I have in my presentation is of Vice President Biden with Congressman James Clyburn, and he is a very prominent member of Congress from South Carolina, and he is known to have a very powerful voice, and his endorsements can really sway an election. And so he came out not too much before the South Carolina primary, and he put his support behind Joe Biden. And people attribute that endorsement to the resounding victory that Joe Biden won in South Carolina. In fact, that was on February 29th. He won almost 50% of the vote in a race that still had, a half dozen or more Democrats who were running. And that was not surprising, I think, to Congressman Clyburn, but it was surprising to a lot of people who had really left Biden for his campaign for dead after New Hampshire. And what we saw afterwards was really telling for how quickly Democrats began to drop out of the race. And it was right then on the 29th, you had Tom Steyer drop out. And then in very quick succession, in less than a week after the 29th, you had Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, Mike Bloomberg, Elizabeth Warren, all drop out. And so we're not even a week from that primary in South Carolina, and the field had come down to essentially Bernie Sanders, Tulsi Gabbard, and Joe Biden. And at the time, I think a lot of people were surprised to see how quickly the field just moved aside, and many of these people that I mentioned as having dropped out threw their support behind Vice President Biden quite quickly. And that gets us back to this idea of the two movements in the Democratic Party and which movement was seen as winning, let's say. And at that point, you had many of the moderate candidates like Klobuchar, like Buttigieg, who came out and strongly supported Biden. But you also had Elizabeth Warren, who came out and ultimately gave her support to Vice President Biden. So at that point, you had a clear indication, I think, of where the Democratic Party thought its best fortunes would be moving into the general election campaign against President Trump. As we get to the spring, I'm not going to say a whole lot because this was really when COVID-19 took hold and most states went into lockdowns or shelter-in-place orders and things like that. And so it was really a quiet time for the Democratic nomination. We had a lot of voting during the lockdown, and we had a lot of states that postponed their primary elections. So over this period of time, 19 states and territories postponed their primaries or caucuses, or they canceled in-person voting altogether. Now, as we know, Wisconsin was not one of those states that canceled its event. In fact, the Wisconsin primary went forward on April 11th. You may recall there was a lot of controversy. Governor Evers tried to get that event postponed, and he was unable to do so. And a couple of the photographs that I have there on my presentation, the one on the top are people in Milwaukee who were waiting in line to vote. And then the one at the bottom would be Assembly Speaker Robin Voss, a UW-Whitewater Political Science Department alum, wearing quite a bit of PPE there with a mask and a gown on, working the polls in his area. And so we had the process going on, but many states actually postponed their voting. Bernie Sanders bowed out on April 8th, the day right after the Wisconsin primary election, and he endorsed Biden shortly thereafter. And I think it's important to point out that the way that Sanders exited the race in 2020 is quite different from the way that he exited the race in 2016. You may recall that it was quite a contentious nomination battle between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, and it took Bernie Sanders quite a bit longer to put his endorsement behind Hillary Clinton. He participated actively in primaries and caucuses, even though the delegate count was not going to move forward in his favor. And what we saw quite differently in 2020 is that Senator Biden and Vice President Biden, but former Senator Biden, and Senator Sanders had a much warmer personal relationship that was made over many years together in the Senate. And so when Senator Sanders dropped out, he did much more early on to encourage his supporters to get behind Vice President Biden. And we saw that continue in the summer, where the two of them created a joint committee to cover several different major issues: healthcare, the economy, the environment, police reform, and other things. And each appointed a member to these working groups, and they ultimately in the summer came up with a joint platform that became the Democratic Party platform, in order to ensure that the interests and goals of the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party were being taken into account by Vice President Biden and his team. So we have a much less contentious period or situation with Bernie Sanders when he drops out in 2020 than we did in 2016. So campaigning in the spring goes virtual, and you have Vice President Biden spending most of his time or all of his time in Delaware. And at that point, once he's the presumptive nominee, you have President Trump getting more engaged in the process. And there's President Trump speaking about Vice President Biden hiding in his basement in Delaware and things like that. In the meantime, as we know, in early March, President Trump was still holding large rallies, but even he was forced to stop those as a result of COVID-19. And I would say that public attention across the board really moved away from the Democratic nomination process or the election at all, and really became focused on COVID-19, the economic issues that resulted as a outgrowth of COVID-19, the high unemployment and businesses shutting down and things like that. And so it was really a quiet spring as far as the presidential election, and particularly as far as the nomination process would go. So as we think about summer, and we can think about how the general election campaign really begins, traditionally people think of Labor Day as the day when the general election campaign gets going. But I'm going to back up a little bit, and I'm going to say that really, if we think about summer, Biden was already the presumptive nominee. And I think that we moved into general election mode, at the beginning of summer. And again, to get back to that idea that there were other issues that tended to be more predominant, again, we had the killing of George Floyd in Minnesota at the end of May, and that set off a series of racial justice protests that continued today in some cities. But that was really the key story. Aside from COVID-19, that was really the key story of the summer. And so as far as media coverage, there still wasn't as much media coverage as you might expect for the general election because of these other big key issues that were still getting a lot of attention by the public and also by the media. But if we think about, what was going on, so there's still a presidential race going on. It's just not getting as much attention as we might normally think that it would. And so I'm going to talk about sort of polling and raising money and advertising and things like that, early summer and late summer. And so when we think about this as far as early summer goes, as we began to look at national polls, what we saw was a fairly consistent lead for Vice President Biden in the range of 5 to 10 points. And that depends on who was doing the polling, and it also depended on maybe how the questions were asked and things like that. But it was fairly consistent looking at national polling. Now, I always caution that what we really need to focus on are state polls and not as much national polls. But early on, aside from the great work that's done, let's say, for example, in Wisconsin with the Marquette poll, a lot of states aren't doing a lot of in-depth polling early on, so people tend to focus more on the national polls. So nationally, Vice President Biden had a decent-sized lead, and that persisted throughout the summer. I would say also I can draw some distinctions about fundraising. So early on, and if you're following this closely, you may have heard about just the significant amounts of money that the Republicans were raising, the Republican National Committee was raising, that the Trump campaign was raising, and there were juxtaposed to what the Biden campaign was raising. And concerns that even, again, if we backtrack a little bit and think about the winter and spring, and historically, Vice President Biden has not been known as a particularly prolific fundraiser. And so there were concerns that this might be a drag on his campaign and an ability to raise big money for his campaign, which we know quite well is key if you're going to run a successful presidential election. And so early on, you had Biden, leading in the polls nationally. You also had a fundraising lag, which causes issues with things like advertising and other means of spending your money. You also saw early on the fact that, again, Vice President Biden was still in Delaware and not doing campaigning. President Trump, on the other hand, was trying to get out as much as possible and doing smaller events to whatever extent he could, but he really thrives on public events and being surrounded by supporters. And so it was important for him to get out as soon as he could. The selection of Kamala Harris as the vice presidential nominee, that came in mid-August. And I'm going to talk about the conventions as well. The Democratic convention was supposed to be held, as again you all know, in Milwaukee earlier. It was supposed to begin in mid-July, but both parties wanted to try to have an in-person convention. So originally what the Democrats did was move their convention from July to August in hopes that COVID-19 would have been better under control and they could have held a convention in person in Milwaukee. So by pushing it back a month, what that did was it also pushed back Vice President Biden's selection of Kamala Harris as the vice presidential nominee. So that came in mid-August. And then very shortly thereafter, you had the two parties hold their conventions. As far as the impact of Kamala Harris on the Democratic ticket, there was a big increase in fundraising for the Democrats after her appointment. It was quite significant that she was a woman, and quite significant as well that she was an African-American woman. And that created, quite a bit of excitement amongst different quarters of the Democratic Party. So that helped get more attention and helped provide a boost to the Biden campaign. Both conventions were held virtually. The Democratic convention was held the third week of August, and then the Republican convention was held the final week of August. The photographs that I have there on my presentation show Vice President Biden and his wife and Kamala Harris and her husband. And then on the other one is President Trump accepting the nomination right there in front of the White House. And if you watched the two conventions, you would have seen that there was a lot more. There were a lot more events as part of the Republican convention that included an audience, whereas the Democrats did things a lot more by video and didn't have an audience. And that was because of COVID-19 and the Biden campaign's strong commitment to upholding the public health guidelines that have been put in place for COVID-19 and how you can hold events in that regard. A lot of criticism was directed toward the president for using the White House for many of the events for the Republican convention. And we will likely hear more about that as we move forward. As we get to post-convention, and we're getting ready to get into the fall, as we get to post-convention, what we see is that Vice President Biden is still maintaining that lead in the polls nationally. And so that really didn't erode so much over the course of the summer. Those same polls that had him 5 or 6 or 7% up nationally in June also showed him up by similar percents after the conventions. Normally, the conventions give the campaigns a boost. This year, the polling didn't really bear that out very much, and people would argue that was potentially because they were virtual conventions and didn't draw the same enthusiasm and attention that they normally would have. As far as fundraising, it's interesting because what we've seen is kind of a reversal of fortunes in regard to fundraising. And more recent reports show that the Biden campaign is doing quite well raising money, while the Trump campaign has spent a lot and doesn't have as much cash on hand as the Biden campaign. So what has that meant? Well, that's meant, for example, that in some key states, including in Wisconsin, the Trump campaign has gone off the air for a bit. Now, there's still third-party groups that are advertising for both candidates, but the Trump campaign has gone off the air in some key battleground states, causing some consternation amongst Republicans who are worried about what that might mean. Okay. Now let's think about the fall. So like I said, the traditional kickoff to the general election campaign is considered to be right after Labor Day. So here's some things to think about and focus on as you're getting ready for the fall election. Just Friday, we learned that Associate Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away, and that has created really an issue that is going to be addressed throughout the campaign. And what we're hearing now has to do with whether or not the president will be able to confirm a nominee to the Supreme Court to replace Ginsburg, when that might happen, who that might be. And that's all really new information that is being, still being worked on right now. But as we understand it, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has indicated that there will be a vote. It's a matter of whether it will be before the election or after. And President Trump indicated this morning in an interview on Fox and Friends that he will be nominating someone. It will be a woman, he said, and that will come forward by the end of this week. So we should expect very quickly. And that is going to be, I think, a big issue that's going to become part of the campaign. Traditionally, there are 3 presidential debates. Those are sponsored by the Commission on Presidential Debates. And this year there will be 3, and there will be 1 vice presidential debate. The presidential debate, the first one comes up quite quickly. It's on September 29th, so just the end of the month. And then there are subsequent debates that will take place in October. President Trump had made a request that either an additional debate be added or the dates of the debates be moved up because early voting has begun in many places. I know, for example, in Wisconsin, people are already mailing in their ballots. And so there was some concern that if you have a debate too late, that in fact, many people will have already cast their votes. So obviously, we're going to keep an eye out for those debates. The debates tend to have a different theme depending on foreign policy, domestic policy, and so that will be something to keep an eye out. Also, the vice presidential debate should be quite interesting. Kamala Harris was a prosecutor in one of her prior positions. So she has experience in debate type situations, and it will be curious to see she and Vice President Pence debate each other. One of the things that people often say is that the vice presidential debate can sometimes be a little bit more contentious because both of the candidates are seen as kind of the attack dog for the candidate that they're running mate. So we'll keep an eye out for that. Something else to take a look at is, where are the candidates going? Where are they holding events? Where are they not going? I think it's interesting now because of COVID-19 to see some of the differences regarding what kind of campaign events are being held. So I mentioned earlier, President Trump loves large events with a lot of supporters. He's been unable to do that to the extent that he would like to because of COVID-19 restrictions. However, he has been holding more events. They tend to be outdoor events. There was one just last week in Nominee in central Wisconsin, and Vice President Biden was in Janesville last week, and we know that President Trump was in Kenosha just a couple of weeks ago. Expect to see both Kamala Harris and Joe Biden make a few more stops in Wisconsin, I would imagine. Vice President Biden is not doing large-scale events. His are much smaller, and they don't tend to include a large audience. In fact, if anyone tuned into the town hall that he took part in last week, it was a drive-in town hall in Pennsylvania, and people actually drove in with their cars, and they sat outside their cars to make sure they could maintain appropriate social distancing. So keep an eye on, what kinds of events are being held, but also what states they're going to, because my next point is about Battleground States. And there's a half dozen or so states that people really believe the election is going to be decided in. For people in Wisconsin, that could be a blessing or a curse. That means that you'll all be getting a lot of visits from candidates. The airwaves will be really packed with campaign commercials and things like that. If you're a political junkie, that is probably exciting to you. If you've had enough already, then you might want to tune out on the TV for a while. But aside from Wisconsin, some of the other key states that people are looking at would include Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Arizona, Nevada, Colorado. Michael Bloomberg, who had run for the Democratic nomination, had promised that he was going to put a lot of money into the 2020 campaign, and he made that commitment just last week. He's promising to put $100 million, $100 million into Florida alone. And so his goal is to allow the Biden campaign a lot of resources in Florida and hopefully flip that state from Trump in 2016 and put that in the win column for Biden. So if you're following the election, keep an eye on some of those states that I mentioned. That's where we're going to see the election won or lost. Okay. Many other states, my own home state of Illinois included, doesn't tend to get a whole lot of attention because we're either, red or blue. And if you're in a solid red or a solid blue state, you don't get the love that a state like Wisconsin does. So, like I said, either appreciate it or not. A big issue this year has been the idea of absentee voting and mail-in voting and early voting. And we're hearing so much about that, and the Postal Service and all kinds of things related to that. And that's something to keep an eye on. As I mentioned earlier, in Wisconsin, there has already been absentee voting. People are mailing in their ballots and sending it in. Wisconsin also has early voting. And some states do fully mail-in voting where everyone mails in their ballot. Wisconsin, as we know, has a combination system. A lot has been made of potential fraud and things like that. I will tell you that Wisconsin has quite a secure absentee voting system in the sense that, and even to vote absentee, you have to make sure that you can provide your ID, and you also have to have a witness sign your ballot. So even if you're voting absentee in Wisconsin, you're still held to the same requirements or standards that would be someone who was voting in person. And the Democratic Party in particular has made a big push, because we're still in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, has made a big push to get people to vote early or absentee or by mail. And so we're expecting numbers of mail voting, absentee voting to be through the roof this year. And that's why there's been some concern about the Postal Service being able to get all the ballots back to where they need to get to. I threw in this idea of will there be an October surprise? People always ask the question of, are there things that might come out of nowhere that could throw the election one way or the other? In 2016, people point to, at the time, head of the FBI, James Comey, coming out and making some claims about Hillary Clinton and her emails and those things related to that. And who knows? I put the question out there, but I don't know whether or not there will be. I think that if you're thinking about a major event that has the potential to impact the election, the thing I started this slide with, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's passing, certainly has the potential, but we really don't know what might come in the next 6 weeks or so before the election. And then finally, thinking about what will election day and election night look like, I already mentioned the fact that there's going to be a lot of people who vote well before election day. So again, in Wisconsin, some of you may have already cast your ballot. And election day for you was this weekend when you filled out your ballot and you put it in the mail and you're done. We're going to see more and more of that this year. And that leads me to, what does that mean election night is going to look like? Many of us are used to tuning on the TV and hearing the state's calls and knowing who the winner is going to be. If not by 10 or 11 p.m. on election night, you wake up the next morning and you check and you see we know who the winner is. This year might not be that way. In fact, this year, because there will be so many people mailing in their ballots and things like that, we might not know who the winner of the election is on election night, and that's okay, because many states have different policies in place that allow for people to, as long as you mail in your ballot by election day, they will count ballots past election day. And, 50 states, 50 different policies on that, and that also creates confusion among people. And so I think that people need to be prepared for the situation where we might not know who the winner of the election is on election night. And things could change. States' voting totals could change as a result of getting all those mail-in ballots counted after the fact, or not by election night. So those are some things to look at, and I hope that I was able to provide a nice recap of the nomination process to bring us all up to speed for what is going to be a great series for the Fairhaven Lecture Series this fall. And now you're all primed and ready to watch all the other lectures. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. We do have a small live audience with us here today, and I'm just going to give them a moment in case anybody has a question. They can throw it in the chat real quick, just for a minute. I'd also like to remind them and anyone viewing this lecture later that Dr. Johnson will be back with us Monday after the election. Is that the 9th, November 9th? She will be with us along with Dr. Jolly Emery, who is the chair of the Political Science Department, and Dr. Eric Lepp, who is an assistant professor in the Political Science Department. And they'll be talking with us about the winners and losers and everybody else from the 2020 fall election. As Dr. Johnson mentioned, we may not know much on the 9th, but regardless, there'll still be lots to talk about. It looks like one question did just come in, and it's when does the Supreme Court begin hearing cases for this year?
So in early October.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so shortly. Great. All right, and with that, I think we'll go ahead and thank you for the question, and thank you for joining us. And again, please come back on the 9th to see Dr. Johnson and the other two panelists for the political science recap. Next week, we'll be here again Monday at 3 o'clock, and we'll be talking to Professor Corey Davis about the communication on the campaign trail. So please join us then. Otherwise, thank you for joining us, and join me in thanking Dr. Susan Johnson. Thank you.